Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is February 2nd, 2026. Happy Groundhog Day. Um, this is 11:05 a.m. This post, I'm going to cover my day on the witness stand, it changed my life. This was a pivotal day of my life. As I look back at my life at age 67, I see my life as before that day and after that day. I want to provide a little background and a few anecdotes relating to this to make this a little more understandable. Um, as I said before, I left home kind of as a rube. And not just because of my household, but also because of my community. I previously mentioned neighboring Bakersfield in Kern County in LA's hinterland. Ventura was a hinterland of Los Angeles, so was Bakersfield. In fact, so was the mountains outside San Bernardino. All the periphery of Los Angeles was kind of hick. It was kind of these poor rural white kind of situations. And the United States, the Western United States, was settled by these people looking for free land and gold. And slaughtering the natives was a profitable pastime in those days. And that mentality still echoes throughout the rural West. And so it's quite often very racist, bigoted. Again, it's still, to me, it's got one foot in the third epoch, like the red states. And so Bible banging and, gun toting and hunting and fishing and all that kind of stuff. And so and again, to me, it's a window into the third epoch, the agrarian epoch. And and Ventura County was not exempt from that. Particularly in the hinterlands of Ventura County, it was definitely that way. But in Ventura and Oxnard were sort of the urban center of Ventura County. It was, in fact, as I'll get to, I actually worked in my last year in college. I worked in a law office. I was actually a janitor for a couple office buildings because one of my closest friends, his father was an attorney, and he was the managing partner of a pretty big law firm in Ventura. And anyway, my last year before I went off to the university, I was the janitor there, and so I cleaned the offices of these law firms and a bunch of other stockbrokers and accountants, all this kind of stuff. Um, and literally, again, this all these events happened. All the events that I talked about my Ventura days, and even being raised, all happened within a 5 mile radius. I mean, it was or like a 5 mile diameter, pretty much. So yeah, this all happened close to where I was raised, and less than a mile, probably a half mile or something from our office there in Ventura. Um, was a one building law school. And this is where Ms. Prosecutor, so the one who prosecuted Dennis there, she was assistant district attorney. That's where she got her law degree. And I have a relative who actually graduated Harvard Law, and he lived in Ventura for a few months. And I heard from him years later that Ventura County, the government there, Ventura County, government, etc. They preferred graduates from that law school. So this is and it was a mill. I mean, a one building law school. I mean, it wasn't exactly Harvard or Ivy Leagues and that kind of stuff. So it was a mill that was intended to get students to pass the bar exam and not much more. So they didn't exactly get a well-rounded education here. And but this is the one that supplied the attorneys to Ventura County's legal system, et cetera. Um, and Ms. Prosecutor, I think she was a housewife before she decided to go to college, and then again became an attorney at this Ventura College of Law. And I early mentioned that the day that I first saw her, I watched her tell a bunch of big lies in about a minute of why the $1 million bail for Dennis was justified. And it was shocking to hear her lie so much. And I earlier said that when Dennis's attorney tried to see if he could work out some kind of deal, her response was, if Dennis pleads guilty to all charges, she'll see to it that he doesn't get the death penalty. So this is the kind of professionalism that we were dealing with there in Ventura County. Um, in fact, she had the look down though, so she looked like. In fact, I mentioned earlier I couldn't remember her name, but Debbie Winger was in Legal Eagles as this Manhattan attorney, and this woman looked like it. She had the look down, so she had the prosecutor attorney look down. It's just when she opened her mouth, it showed that she wasn't quite a polished Manhattan attorney. And she was a housewife pretending that she was. Um, and that law firm. So there were things I saw at that law firm, and so and well, just a couple anecdotes. So, and the law firm that again that owned the building. In fact, the managing partner actually owned the investment that owned that building. He built that building, and there was another one he owned, and so I cleaned those offices. And it was one of them was doctors' offices, I think, and then yeah, some was doctors' offices, and again, accountants, stockbrokers, attorneys, this kind of thing. Um, and in the office, there were probably about a dozen offices around the perimeter, and then in the middle of the office was the law library. And this was I worked there in 1978, 1979. This is before the electronic age, and so that law library. All the time. Their trash cans were filled with inserts where they would update. So they have binders full of legal stuff, but they'd be updated with a subscription to keep current. And so they'd be constantly throwing out the pages out of these 3-ring binders, etc. But also there were books. There were all these books also would also get thrown away. And it was a big law library, and it had thousands of volumes, I believe. Yeah, probably thousands of volumes of books and stuff. And some of the books looked pretty slick. They were like almost gilt. I'm not sure any had leather bindings, but they were pretty fancy books, looking books. On tort law and all this kind of stuff. The stuff that the tools that lawyers need to do what they do. And there were constantly the corner offices were the partners, and then the non-corner offices were filled with their associates, etc. And there was one new attorney I remember who had just come from the district attorney's office. So they had hired him from the district attorney's office, and this guy actually he got his law degree at Berkeley. And in fact, today he's kind of a famous judge, and he's a retired judge. He's actually on Berkeley staff today. But back then, he was just starting out. And I was friendly, and so when I work in the evening, some guys would be working there after 5, and so I'd encounter people who worked there as I was cleaning the office. So Zoom crashed once again. Yeah, so this is an unstable platform, unfortunately, but that's what I got for free at this point. So anyway, let's see, where was I? So so anyway, this attorney, he was new, working at that law firm, and we were friendly. And one evening, I was working there, and I came to his office to clean it. And his office was pretty Spartan. It was, he had a desk with a chair, and then 2 chairs, facing him in front of his desk for his clients. And behind where the people would be sitting would be there was a bookcase. And it was pretty Spartan, right? There were really not too many books in this bookcase. And so one evening I'm cleaning the offices, and and he's still there, and I talk to him, and I'm chucking out. I think in my trash can were all, a bunch of books that I was, taking out to the dumpster. And he said, "Wait, over the next several weeks and months, whatever, it's like when you're throwing away books that really look like good looking books, I want you to put them on my bookshelf there." I was like, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'll be happy to help." So when I did that, so I put all these books that were going to get chucked out, but they're good looking books. And so I ended up putting them on his bookshelf instead. And it was, I was like 20 years old at the time. So I really didn't, I didn't appreciate what I was seeing, and how he was. And in fact, later on, it reminded me of The Great Gatsby. where uh, all these uncut books in his library that would never be read. Yeah, so it was all for show. So this guy was, having me fill his bookcase with meaningless books to impress his clients because you had to look impressive. So anyway, it was part of the show. Uh, anyway, so I don't do law firms do that today? I doubt it, but anyway, yeah, they don't have again books are getting passe, right? So and then several years later, actually my father told me about that law firm that I worked at, and one of the associates. In fact, I think he made partner actually. I think he was a partner in the firm. And my father told him, and so what it was one of our friends, one of my father's friends, from his engineering days, and a real close friend of the family. And the guy had outlived two of his wives, tragically, right? And so, and the second wife, when she died, her ex-husband used his children to challenge it's called contesting her will, and so she made a will, and they said no, we don't agree. We're the rightful heirs, and her husband shouldn't be entitled to any of it. And so they contested her will and prevailed, and so they cleaned him out. So this is a friend of the family. They cleaned the guy out after his wife dies, and again, her children did this when spurred by her ex-husband. And it was, I mean, that's some dark stuff, And anyway, so I later learned that the law firm I worked for, they were the guys who did this, and that was a sobering moment hearing about that. How they, yeah, to me that was a deeply dishonest thing to do in my law firm, but I guess it was legal, at least in Ventura County. Yeah, so they cleaned the guy out. And I remember, stuff that they had bought together, like after they were married, etc. Unless he could provide the receipts that they had bought something like 30 years ago, then it was forfeited. Yeah, so this guy lost almost everything. So yeah, it's our legal system. So I think that was before. I think I heard that before my days with Dennis. So. Uh, And so I was slowly getting awakened, slowly. So, and again, I testified in late November 1988, and I mentioned in the previous post preliminary hearing and some of the things that were going on. Yeah, and so then, and again, everybody had been chased into hiding or fled, and leaving literally a handful of us there trying to defend Dennis there in Ventura. And I became the star witness because I was his partner. I was his business partner. I had been there through everything that happened in Ventura, I was key witness. Well, again, they had chased everybody, lied, threatened, all this kind of stuff. Criminal behavior. So it's definitely criminal behavior on behalf of the sheriff's deputies, etc. And uh, and of course, I was going to testify, but the prosecution saw to it that I was subpoenaed like probably a dozen times. And so it was something I just kept getting subpoena after subpoena to appear for the prosecution. And I think I'm sure I was on the list of witnesses for the defense, so they knew I was going to testify. And in many events in my life, particularly around these kind of situations, it wasn't until years later I kind of understood what was happening. And in this instance, I think they were trying to intimidate me before I testified. In fact, I mentioned how I was driving down to Los Angeles to work, and one day when I got home, I come home, and Mr. Deputy Sidekick, I call him Mr. Sidekick. He was the guy who got promoted to sergeant after Dennis got arrested. While Mr. Deputy was promoted to lieutenant, promotions all around, etc. He was waiting for me. He was parked in front of my house, waiting for me to show up from home so he could personally serve me a subpoena. And anyway, and they were never going to get me alone in an interrogation room without an attorney. So I refused to play the game that people were encouraging me to play. Cowardly. So again, the cowardice of people around me was all part of my awakening, was seeing all this cowardice and helping them out, and the theft and the criminality. This was a big part of how I woke up. And so, and Mr. Researcher, he fled into hiding right around the time I testified. And I can't remember if it was before or after, but he was already hiding in his house to avoid the subpoena. So I knew he wasn't gonna testify. And so then he actually began fled into hiding at like 3 a.m. One morning because there was a subpoena server that was camped outside his house during all the hours of the day. So he snuck out while the subpoena server was sleeping. And again, was in hiding for months. So anyway, so I was the star witness. Um, and anyways, that's a little background of my day on the witness stand. And my future wife took the day off from work to watch me testify. And so, and I testified all day long. So I was the only, I was actually, there's somebody testified before me. So I started testifying at 9 a.m. or something, at 10 a.m., something like that. And I testified the whole day. And when I got to the White House, Dennison's wife, Allison, was there. And again, Dennis and his wife were these big Christians. And so Allison actually, she held my hands and prayed. She prayed for my testimony to be, to help. And so she had to pray. And then what she told me, just a second, put on hold. Okay, I'm back. So anyway, so Allison prayed with me. And again, she said that, like she and Dennis survived a murder attempt in their home in their journey. There were people in their house looking for them to kill them. And so they had survived so many outrages. Dennis should be dead dozens of times over. And Allison said there before I walked into the courtroom that this was the worst. She goes, "This is the worst of all," was what they were going through. Yeah. So anyway, and so the local newspaper, one I grew up reading, one my mother worked for, there was a cub reporter. So he was assigned to the courthouse, I guess, and so he was reporting on our preliminary hearing. So he authored the articles, the many articles that there were about us, and he was about my age. Again, cub reporter, young guy. So he was maybe 30, something like that. And as I walked into the courtroom, high theater greeted me. And so Mr. Deputy was actually holding court with the cub reporter right in front of me. And they were laughing. So he was regaling the cub reporter on all the criminality and stuff that we had done in Dennis and the criminal of the century and all this kind of stuff. And they were laughing, ha 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 ha, laughing, etc. As I walk into the room, they were actually blocking my path to the witness stand, laughing together. And this was like 2 seconds after I walked into the courtroom, they're blocking my way. And I came to understand that this was all carefully choreographed by Mr. Deputy. And as I mentioned with the raid, Mr. Deputy kind of seemed confused when he asked me if that was our building, etc. I was watching an acting job the entire time. So this was more of his acting job. So he was actually choreographing the scene as I walked into the courtroom to intimidate me before I got on the witness stand. Yeah, this is what he was doing. It gets better, a lot better. So anyway, so I was a key witness, particularly regarding fraud charges. And they had Dennis and Allison had prepared, I think 100 questions for me, or some number like that. And I only answered maybe 10 or a dozen. I only got through a small fraction of the questions they had for me. But as soon as I got sworn in, this judge actually came out of retirement to preside over the preliminary hearing. And it had been running for about a month at that time. And again, I was the star witness for the defense. And as soon as I got on the witness stand, he actually made an announcement to the court that he hoped my testimony would not take long, as this was costing the county and all this kind of stuff. So the prosecution could spend endless funds to bring people from all over the country to testify for a month. And as soon as the key witness of the defense gets on the witness stand, the judge is saying, "I hope this doesn't take long." So, and again, that statement, again, I'd never been in a courtroom. I'd never been on a witness stand. This is like my third time in a courtroom. I really had no idea what I was in for. And so many of these events later on, I'm going, oh, that's what was going on. And that was another one. So the judge was actually broadcasting an attitude that I shouldn't be on the witness stand, that they need to get me off the witness stand really fast. And Dennis's attorney didn't protest at all. In fact, his attorney, as I kind of found out, he was kind of in on it. Yeah, so your own attorney really doesn't defend you very well. This was, yeah, because he'd been gotten to. Again, it was so obvious the political nature of this whole thing, this big show trial kind of thing, that Dennis's attorney was actually cowed by it. And so the way that the courtroom was arranged was that directly in front of, so I sat on the witness stand, and next to me sat the judge. You know, he was like 10 feet away, probably in his higher throne. And there was the court clerk who was recording the testimony. And there was a deputy, an armed deputy or two in the courtroom. And then there was, again, Dennis and his attorney, and then Ms. Prosecutor, and then Mr. Deputy, being the arresting officer, he was sitting next to her, directly in front of me. So he was about, I don't know, 20 feet in front of me, 15, some number like that, directly in front of me, which I realized later was not an accident. And the public seats were almost empty. So it was his sidekick, I call him Mr. Sidekick. He sat a few rows behind Mr. Deputy, right behind him. And then the cub reporter, actually, maybe the row, yeah, he sat really close behind Mr. Deputy. And then a few rows behind him was the cub reporter. And then on the other side of the courtroom in the back was my future wife, who was, again, took the day off to watch me testify. And Allison was sitting behind, Dennis and his attorney. And that was about it. There was hardly, it might have been one or two other people there, maybe. But those are the only ones I remember that were in the courtroom while I testified. So my testimony began. And once again, I have to remember that I believe, again, I can't remember now, because you get cross-examined, et cetera. So I'm not sure if the first questions were asked by the prosecution or defense. I was a defense witness, so I think I was being asked. Yeah, now I think it was the defense attorney was asking me the questions first. And then I was cross-examined by Ms. Prosecutor, and she asked her own questions. I think that was the order of events. And so anyway, so I was a witness stand, and they're asking me questions, and I'm sitting here, with my hands folded like this in my suit and tie. I was like 30 years old, and I'm answering their questions. And the big event for my day of testimony was that every time I said something, literally, like every time I said something, Mr. Deputy would make a visible reaction to my testimony. And it wasn't subtle. So this happened dozens of times that day. So I would make a statement, and Mr. Deputy would be sitting there, and he would turn his body around and hold his hand to his mouth, like he was saying some, sort of stage whispering to his sidekick sitting behind him. And then he would turn back to me, with this grin on his face. In fact, I'm gonna show you what it looked like. So he's sitting there, and then he goes, and then he's smiling at me as he turns back to me. Those antics wouldn't have lasted 10 seconds in a 5th grade classroom. And the judge pointedly ignored this imbecilic behavior. In fact, many years later, I read that Dennis's attorney, this so-called maverick attorney, once he rolled his eyes in the courtroom, and he was actually disciplined by the court, for actually rolling his eyes. This guy was practically doing jumping jacks, okay? And he was, and some of his reactions were not exactly quiet either. So he was actually making noises from his seat there. And I was shocked. I was shocked. In fact, he was in charge of the jail. Again, probably in charge of the jail, but he didn't run it. And so for the whole month of the preliminary, he just laid around in court, looking like the cat that had just feasted on canaries. Again, and holding court with the cub reporter and this kind of stuff. Yeah, this was again, this was the turning point of my life when this happened. And so, yeah, so he was my pantomiming adversary as I was testifying. Yeah, oh, it was surreal to me. I really, I had a hard time believing this was happening as I was testifying. And of course, he was trying to intimidate me. I wouldn't get on my knees in his office, etc. So he's going to see if he can intimidate me while I was testifying. And Dennis later told me that how it worked was he was the arresting officer. This is a preliminary hearing, and so he was kind of on the legal hook if it got. So if the purpose of the preliminary hearing was the judge determining if it warranted a trial or not. That's kind of what that was about. And so, yeah, Mr. Deputy was kind of on the legal hook until the judge remanded it to trial, until the hearing was over, if he did. So a judge could dismiss it for lack of evidence or whatever. But anyway, this is what I went through that day. And for me, what was again the why it was a pivotal moment of my life was that until that moment, until that day in the courtroom, Mr. Deputy, again, going back to when the raid began, to me talking to him, etc., he acted like a Boy Scout, looked and acted just like a Boy Scout, just doing my job, just protecting the public. And when he started doing that, it was a psychopath who unmasked himself to me. So he unmasked himself to me when I was on the witness stand. Yes, this guy's a gangster, and he made it very clear. Made it very clear he was a gangster, but he had the power, and I didn't. So this was and the judge ignored it. The prosecutor ignored it. They just let him try to intimidate me as I was testifying. Yeah. And so, in fact, I skip ahead a little bit. Years later, in fact, when I saw Dennis last year, I talked about, and I've told Dennis before, that was a turning point in my life because I was having my face rubbed in evil then. Yeah, it was evil, and that's why I go, oh, this is evil. This isn't it has nothing to do with protecting the public or anything. This is evil. And again, Mr. Deputy was just a hitman, so he was just a hitman doing his dirty. And again, on behalf of Global Elite, although I'm sure he didn't know it. In fact, the under the table money that I'm pretty sure was almost certain was paid by the CIA and friends to corrupt officials in Ventura County to make this happen. Yeah, Mr. Deputy probably, maybe he got some of that, maybe he didn't, but his career was made. This made him. In fact, as I mentioned before, his annual pension today is over $300,000 a year, and so yeah, this made him. So if he didn't get under the table money, they made it worth his while to do what he did. Again, promoted to lieutenant. His psychic got promoted. In fact, his prosecutor got promoted to be a judge a few years later. So this is how the system operates. So yeah, so this was and Dennis, when I saw Dennis last year, when we were talking about, I'm almost grateful to Mr. Deputy for showing me the meaning of evil. Yeah, so it's like I didn't get it until his day in the courtroom. Then oh, this is what evil is. Okay. And so it was awakened. So and as I've said this before, if I didn't have my ride with Dennis, I probably wouldn't have anything we're saying. Really, I'd have been naive. And in the years since then, I've encountered many people, well-intended, so many of them, boys and Girl Scouts who were trying to make free energy happen, etc., but they were naive, hopelessly naive. And I realized that naive people, I mean, it's life risking to be naive in the free energy field, and you can really damage efforts by naivete and lack of discernment. And so I saw this, and this is future posts. I'll get into this, and it's one reason why I don't have anything to do with the free energy field today, because the people in it, they don't have the right. It's either criminals, con men, or really naive people who are a bunch of just naifs, who are just lambs to the slaughter. And so yeah, I saw that show too many times. Anyway, at the lunch break. So at the lunch break, I actually I went to took the lunch break with my wife, and we were 10 minutes from our house. And I can't remember. I think we took a lunch break maybe right there, right next to the courtroom. But at the lunch break, I asked my future wife, I said, did you see what he's doing? That Mr. Deputy's doing? And she was focused on me, so she hadn't really noticed his antics. And I said, keep an eye on him after the lunch break. Well, he did not disappoint her. In fact, it escalated. So all of his theatrics escalated after the lunch break. Yeah, and so in fact, when the day was over, I said, "So you saw it?" She goes, "Wow, that was unprofessional." Yeah, she was astounded by how unprofessional he was. Well, that's one way of saying it, but the context, yeah, she didn't really understand that I was having my face rubbed in evil. Yeah, and again, if you didn't understand the concept of what was happening, you could just go, "Oh, he was just being unprofessional," but he was being evil. And so, and he tried it on the wrong man. He was trying to intimidate me. It backfired on him. So, yeah, tried it on the wrong guy. So, some of the questions and my replies were memorable. Again, this is almost 40 years ago, but there's some things are crystal clarity, that day. Yeah, and so yeah, the defense was in such dire straits they chased everybody off that they were asking me about thermodynamics, and I actually gave answers that I actually knew something about it. And so I remember when I made my reply on Carnot and thermodynamics, etc. Oh, Mr. Deputy made a reaction like, "Oh, gee, the kid knows something. Give him a point," kind of thing. And so yeah, yeah, he reacted to everything I said very visibly, very theatrically. And at one point, Ms. Prosecutor asked me whether I had heard Mr. Researcher tell Dennis that he was going too fast. And Dennis, the eternal optimist, Dennis always thinks he's going to deliver it next year or whatever. And that's part of what Dennis does. And so, yeah, a little optimistic. I said, if we didn't have the world's best heating system, I would have maybe been more nervous about what Dennis was doing. But that's all we're really doing and telling the world we're pursuing free energy, which we were. But we had the world's best heating system that was still biased, still is today, still the best heating system in the world. So we definitely could have built an effort around that. Yeah, that's what I was there for, really. That's what I really wanted to do. And we got wiped out before we could. And Mr. Researcher, he may have had misgivings that Dennis was going too fast. In fact, later on, he told me some of the stuff, but he didn't think Dennis was, and Dennis wasn't scientifically literate, so he was a promoter, entrepreneur, but he had amazing talent, technical talent behind him. And Dennis himself is a genius. So Dennis knew better than a lot of his engineers how the heat pump worked, etc. So yeah, Dennis was no slouch, but he wasn't scientifically literate, and that would come out a lot. And that's just, he can't know everything. That's why I had experts around him that did. And so anyway, so Miss Prosecutor asked me whether I had heard Mr. Researcher told Dennis that he was going too fast. And I truthfully answered no. So if Mr. Researcher had his misgivings, he would tell them to me privately, and he did a few times, but I never heard him do it in front of Dennis because it isn't easy telling Dennis something we didn't want to hear. So this was part of. So Dennis is again a champion debater, etc. So if they did have a conversation, I wasn't there for it. So I truthfully said no. But what happened was that, and if you get Dennis's book, you'll understand more of the color around why this was a very inappropriate question to ask me. But anyway, they asked me this, if I'd heard that, and the defense, Dennis's attorney, protested. He said he objected that, and I think it had to do with hearsay, maybe. But anyway, they were pitting me against, Dennis, and then also Mr. Researcher. And anyway, and so the judge overruled the objection. He said, no, the witness is instructed to answer the question. And so when I answered truthfully, no, literally about 10 seconds later, the judge said, I reversed myself, so strike his testimony from the record. So, and again, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know if that happens normally. I don't know. Or regularly. I don't know. But yeah, he ordered my testimony to be stricken from the record. And a year and a half later, when we were in this misconduct hearing, and Mr. Researcher ends up getting sequestered by Ms. Prosecutor and interviewed, I saw the correspondence from her to Dennis. She accused me of perjury for my truthful answer. Yeah. So yeah, he was. Yeah, I was in their firing line for testifying to the truth. So this was, yeah, they were trying to pit me against Mr. Researcher, my word against his, but what he thought about Dennis's efforts. So anyway, it was, yeah, all ugly. Yeah, yeah. She was reaching for anything. She was digging. She was making her own dirt, trying to tag us with dirt and stuff. So all ugly. Um. So my most memorable reply, however, was when this prosecutor asked me how much money that we had taken in during the effort in Ventura between the time we hit Ventura until Dennis was arrested. So that was less than a year. So that was less than a year between hit Ventura and Dennis was arrested with $1 million bail. And I answered with, oh, about 2 million. And that was my guess. I said they had stolen all my records, took all my records before the raid, et cetera. So I just had my accountant's estimate. Oh, I think it's maybe $2 million. And Mr. Deputy almost jumped out of his seat as he turned around to his sidekick and he was all his body language. And as my wife reported to me, the cub reporter also laughed along with him. They're all laughing at $2 million. And I guess the laugh, in fact, this was the kind of the headline of the article they wrote about us the cub reporter wrote about us the next day was this $2 million. And they do this. So $2 million is what we maybe took in. Well, they act like it all stuck to Dennis's hands somehow, which is, it's stupid if you understand how the business world works. It's got gross revenues, So yeah, it was the reaction was totally stupid. But it is designed to make the sensational claim that Dennis had stolen $2 million from the public. And this cub reporter, his articles were essentially dictation from Mr. Deputy as he was, laughing with him as I walked into the courtroom. And I later learned, so years later, I learned that I was watching Ed Herman's propaganda model, the third filter in action, which is sources. And so, yeah, so this guy was a sycophant to Mr. Deputy, the cub reporter. He was just reporting whatever Mr. Deputy wanted him to. So journalism, he was a stenographer. He wasn't a journalist. And in the most corrupt county in the United States, or right up there near the top, this apparently was standard operation, which I found out from Gary Wing a few months later. But yeah, so what I was seeing was normal in this show trial. Yeah, so this is kind of like a stall in a show trial. And Mr. Deputy's behavior made that very clear to me that this had nothing to do with justice or protecting the public. This is a hit job. This is a snuff job on behalf of the global elite. That's what was really happening. And I got off the witness stand a changed man. Yeah, so I walked in the door that morning, still with some naivete to lose, and I walked out a different man. And I would never see the world the same way again after my day on the witness stand. Yeah. And I actually later mentioned my shock to Allison about when Mr. Deputy's, pantomime behavior as I was testifying. And she said they did it for all the defense witnesses. So I guess I wasn't being singled out. This is their normal behavior. Yeah, this is how Ventura County justice works. So yeah. And it was a thing where it really, it was only in hindsight that I realized it was shocking it was shocking the day it happened, but it was years and years later with the benefit of hindsight that I saw how pivotal that day was in my life. Yeah, today I see my life as my life before that day and after that day. And when I got taught the meaning of evil by Mr. Deputy and friends. And this was my awakening process. So that day on the witness stand was when I really became awake. And it was the end of a long process. And I look back at my life, and my awakening process began when I was 12. My family changed its diet from processed food to whole food to save my father's health, which resulted in a health miracle. So that was really the beginning. And again, as my readers and listeners and I'll do medical racket posts one of these days, videos. That book was eventually banned in the United States, which I didn't learn actually till after my Ventura days, that it was banned in the United States for being contrary to medical dogma. And today it's It's orthodoxy's first line of defense. Yeah. So this was, and so again, this process of awakening was a long time. So between the time we changed our diet till the time I realized that the book had been banned was 20 years. That was a 20 years. It was 20 years between those two events. And so, and I look back, and my first paranormal experiences at age 16 ruined me as a mainstream scientist before I ever began. And that summer in Europe actually was kind of the beginning of my culture awakening. My Rube upbringing was kind of starting to, deteriorate at that time, I would say. And when I desperately prayed for guidance at age 19, and the voice in my head suggested I go study business, that began. Again, that was a big, huge pivotal moment in my life, and I changed my studies from science to business. And then I had 8 years after that of idealism and disillusionment, which I've discussed quite a bit. And then I led to my second desperate prayer, which landed me in Dennis's company 10 days later. And I know that this is my otherworldly friends at work, and this is what being on special assignments like. It ain't fun. Or it's rarely fun. This is my experience. It isn't fun very often. And and so when I walked into Dennis's company for the interview 10 days after that voice told me to move to Seattle from Los Angeles, that was the beginning of my wild ride, which escalated when I became Dennis's partner less than a year later. Again, so the things we saw in body, again, my ex-girlfriend's attacks and stuff were just gentle previews of what I was in for. And again, when I walked off that witness stand, I would never see the world the same again. And my cognitive dissonance. So, and again, cognitive dissonance is something where you have beliefs, which you're generally indoctrinated into, and then you have experience that is contrary to those beliefs. And so it creates what's called cognitive dissonance. So you have a belief, but you have reality, and they don't match. And so there's three different ways of dealing with cognitive dissonance, and two of them are pathological. So one of them is that when you have cognitive dissonance, then what you do is you emphasize all the positive cognition, so your beliefs. So when you get the information that maybe the United States isn't such a wonderful place after all, then you start coming up with, oh, here's all the reasons why it is a great place. And then the negative parts, the negative events that show why it's not a great place, then you sort of ignore those, suppress those, and don't remember those. And so these are the two sort of pathological reactions, so you can keep your beliefs intact. And what eventually, the way to resolve it though is to realize that, oh, my beliefs are inaccurate. It wasn't right. And so that's the healthy way to actually modify your beliefs or your perspective based on your experience, to realize that what I was told isn't right. The beliefs I was fed were not reality. And so much of my work is about helping people resolve their cognitive dissonance, because we've been lied to in all ways, in all directions. And this is how our world works. As I was learning the hard way. Yeah, so my illusions, by the time I walked out of that courtroom, so many of the illusions I've been raised with were shattered and would never be rebuilt. And as I said, a couple of years later, I began my days of study. And I was so ready for my days of study because I had been awakened. And as I said, if I hadn't been through what I had been through, and it's, how to say it, there were so many things in my head that were happening, relating to all this, where it was like one day I saw it again, in that day in the courtroom, I go, this is what evil looks like. Okay, I understand now. And as I said, Mr. Deputy tried it on the wrong guy. Yeah, they were used to people cowering and hiding and fleeing and stuff, and these guys were cowards, so they weren't used to people standing up to them. That's what they weren't used to. And so, yeah, they're used to their evil deeds usually would prevail. And this time, it didn't, and that's coming. So, yeah. So that was anyway. So my life up until then, I was 30 years old, and that day on the witness stand I call that my greatest awakening. I had awakening moments all before that, but that was the big one. Yeah, I would never see the world the same way again. And human behavior after that would never really surprise me again. So yeah, I had been awakened. So anyways, that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.